Okay, welcome back everybody to Score into Picture Full Breakdown episode number 2, where we're learning about music production and synthesization. Okay, now today we have quite a bit to cover, but before we jump into it, I want to go ahead and play you the full track one time through so that way we can remember what we're going to be covering for today. All right, here we go. I absolutely just love this track that I made, and especially the ending when everything comes in. I love the way the timpani and the tubular bells are really going at it with that, chromatic melody, counter melody line in the bass. Dum 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 dum, and that's also doubled in the brass and stuff. Anyway, let's get into it. So, like I said, I have a lot to cover today. Okay, this is going to be quite a long video, but I'm just hoping that you guys find value in this, okay? So let's go over some things first. What is synthesization, okay? Synthesization is a process that involves inputting notes into a computer sequencing program like MIDI data, which then produces sounds or tones using virtual instrument software and hardware. Okay, we use synthesization as composers to create quote unquote realistic orchestral mock-ups. And when I say realistic, what I mean by that is mock-ups that are actually playable by live musicians, even if it means doing multiple takes of recordings, like so that way you can layer things later on. Okay, not realistic as to not mean what necessarily is traditional or idiomatic in the way that orchestral may be used in concert music. That's a little different. Okay, so realistic meaning it can be played by live musicians, but not necessarily in the traditional sense where you might have a concert music and a concert performance. You only can play something one time. Okay, so with that being said, let's get on with it. So my agenda for today is to cover a few things. Number one, to review each section of the orchestra, what each section is doing: woodwinds, brass, melodic perks, regular perks, choir, and strings. And then to go over like music production and mixing techniques used for this cue to add that film score element, which is what I've said we we're going to be covering on last time. Okay, so really quickly, let's just get into going over each orchestral family really quickly. So here we have the woodwind. So that was an orchestral technique where we use dovetailing, basically, where bottom line is played all the way up through the rising pitches of an orchestral family. Love that contrabassoon line right there. It's just so powerful. Simple ostinato. It gets a lot done though. Again, contrabassoon down below. Another dovetailing line. Dovetailing again. So again, as you can hear, I have dovetailing throughout. And next we have the brass. So as you can hear right there, the brass is basically covering the majority of the harmonic and in many cases melodic material for this cue. Let's move on to the melodic percussion. There we go. Tubular bell to let us into the cue. I like using tubular bell for stuff like that. Quartalis. Little flutters, piano. It feels very bare, right? But together, all these smaller parts help to make the grand sound that you hear at the end. Something I got from John Williams' xylophone comes in very handy with piano to support melodies or counter melodies as you want to cut through the mix. But anyway, let's keep going. Here is the untuned percussion. Okay, there's that. Next we have the choir, mostly, I think it's just strictly actually from East West. Here we go. This is not a composition video, but it's important to note that if you use certain motives within your piece over and over again, repetition just naturally makes things more memorable, and it makes things more cohesive, connecting ideas together. All right, here's the strings part. Low strings, then a run. All right, so there you have it. All of the sections of this cue played back for you. So now we're going to get into some of these music production and mixing techniques. So yeah, let's get started. Feel free to pause the video at any point in time. I have the notes up here to make sure that I'm as clear and concise as possible, but also I have it up here so that way you guys can see it and take note of it, maybe screen capture, whatever the case may be. All right, so here we go. First point of focus for music production and mixing techniques is to utilize CC data, which is just a continuous controller. Continuous controllers are mapped all throughout your MIDI controller, and they use 128 CCs technically. But for when it comes to making orchestral mockups, we really just focus on 4, and even then we even narrow it down a little bit more than that. The first continuous controller or CC that we use is CC number 1, which is the mod wheel, which tends to control volume and expression. Volume you can think of as dynamics, and expression you could think of like timbre changes. Then you have CC number 2, which is like breath control, which equals vibrato. CC number 7 is like the master volume control, which you don't really want to touch, because then you got to go back and fix it if you mess with something else, and it's just, you want to really keep that hands off. CC number 11 is expression, which is more so focusing on the volume within the instrument itself. Okay, within the instrument track, the instance itself. Okay, so the ones that we focus on, that I like to focus on a lot, is CC1, because most orchestral VST companies, they already build it in, so that way CC1, the mod wheel, is controlling both volume and expression. And this is really important because that's a realistic combination as far as how most instruments actually work. If you listen to a trumpet play at a lower dynamic, the timbre will also be different versus that same trumpet playing at a louder dynamic like forte. Now you get that really brassy, punchy kind of sound that they're known for. So that's what we mean by, like, hopefully your orchestral libraries already are programmed this way, but if they are not, that's okay. You should be able to go in and program them accordingly. For example, for East-West, sometimes I have to go in and just set this parameter on my own, and sometimes I have to do that, which is totally fine. Okay, the next thing that helps me with music production, mixing kind of thing, is using ensemble patches for more presence in a mix and ease of writing, like more than one line in a single track. So a few things to be mindful of. Number one is that the amount of players available to you is needs to still idiomatically make sense when you would go off and give this music to real musicians. Here's what I mean by that. A large symphonic string section, right, like an orchestra, right, a symphonic orchestra. You take the string section for that symphonic orchestra, which would be a large string symphonic orchestra section. It would be roughly 60 players. It is divided into 16 violin ones, 14 violin twos, 12 violas, 10 celli, and 8 double basses, right, 5 sections. When playing an ensemble string patch, right? Which is all of the string players together, all 60 players playing one note, okay? If you decide to then program 9 notes on that ensemble string patch instance, okay, what you're actually doing is multiplying the amount of players playing each note. So let's say you take those 60 players and you multiply that by 9. And so in the DAW, this sounds really huge and epic, but in real life, 9 different notes played by strings would actually indicate that the 5 subsections would need to like use divisie. And divisie is basically where you split up the number of players playing a chord that's like more than, let's say, 4 or 5 notes or so. So that way, like each section is able to divide their group up. So that way, let's say half of the violin ones are playing the top note, half the violin ones are playing the second note, half the violin twos, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what actually happens though is that the sound in real life becomes thinner because you're dividing the amount of players playing a single note. Okay, so in other words, a VST, if you're playing 9 notes, you're multiplying the sound, which makes it amplified, it makes it louder. But in real life, 9 notes would be divisie, which means you might get 6 to 7 players per note, which makes the sound actually a lot more soft. Okay, an example of that I have in this cue is the woodwinds ensemble clarinets that I have, and also the brass and the trumpets. I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys what it sounds like where I have the woodwinds playing. So here I have a 2 clarinets on like ensemble track, technically speaking, because it's 2 clarinets recorded for this specific instance, but I'm using like more than 2 notes. I think at some points I'm using 3, and then over here it looks like I'm using 4, and so that's an example of where I'm like realistically, and even over here I'm still technically I have a line here that would go. So this is not necessarily realistic in the sense of or idiomatic or traditional sense of being able to play in a concert piece, because there's just not enough unless you had a lot of money or sponsored and you got a lot of clarinets to play, right? But otherwise, if this was like a film score, maybe you can make this happen by having 1 solo clarinet record this line, while 2 to 3 clarinets can go ahead and just record this one passage. I'm gonna go ahead and play that back now. Here's what it sounds like. Okay, so that was an example of using an ensemble patch in the case here, woodwinds. Another example of using ensemble patches in this track was for my strings, specifically because I wanted to basically have again more presence, more body in the mix for specific lines. So for example, we have this line right here, which is also doubled in the woodwinds, but it's like a dovetailing line, and I didn't want to take away from what's going on down here with the actual musicians. So I just basically recorded it here with the ensemble patch. That's how that goes.